Hello. Now I'm going to talk to you about register, which, as you see here, is sometimes summarized as the right variety of English at the right time. Uh, what we mean here is that at certain times, during certain language events, you expect a certain kind of language to be used. For example, even at the start of this talk that I'm giving right now, I said hello, and now I'm introducing the topic quite generally. That's what you'd expect, right? The hello probably is not absolutely necessary, but you expect some sort of greeting like that at the start of whether it's written or spoken, especially uh, in a spoken one, you get something like hello. In a written one, you might get dear so and so, right? In a more formal one. And because this is an informative language event, I'm hoping to teach you something. It's quite common for things like this to start with an overview of the topic. So I think just the fact that I'm doing those things for this right time, I'm using the right variety of English, the right linguistic features that you expect for this, and therefore it makes you feel like you know what's going on, like I'm doing things according to the conventions that you expect for this. Of course, different language events have different conventions, different expectations about how the language will be used. That's what we're going to talk about now. Uh, Now, first, contrast this with what you know already from having heard me talk in the past, that variation in accent and dialect, right? Different phonology, different lexis, different syntax, different morphology, that's variation according to the user. Today, we're not talking about that. We're talking about how even the same person does not always speak English, use English, writing as well, at the same time. Variation in register is variation according to the use of the language. That's from Michael Halliday, and who is a very well-known linguist, and that's a very well-known definition, right? That we're talking about the differences in language according to what you're using the language for. That's register. So generally, we speak and write differently depending on whom we are talking to, right? What's the topic of the communicative event, talking or writing, of course. What's the purpose of the communicative event? We expect different things to happen as those things differ. Think of a friendly chat. Something like this might be appropriate. I got your note, thanks. A little more formal. Thank you, I received your message. What you probably recognize this as more formal. It would be useful to maybe pause for a second here and think to yourself, can you precisely identify what makes this more formal? Now, whether you paused or not, I'm going to talk about now those formalities. Thanks becomes thank you, which is just longer, right? It's the full form, thank you, then thanks. Generally, we think of those fuller, more elaborate bits of language as being more formal, right? Thanks versus thank you, can't versus cannot, right? The can't is less formal than cannot, the full form. So there's that. We've got received versus got, right? What's the difference between received versus got? Uh, Again, received is just longer. That's a very strong, it's not 100% accurate, but generally in English, longer things are more formal, right? Received is longer than got. Partly it has to do with the origins of the word. Received comes from French, right? It comes from the French verb to receive, recevoir. So you've got a longer word, it's French, and ultimately from Latin. Uh, think about how got or the verb get is quite lexically productive in meaning. You know, you can say get it as in understand it. You can say get back as in back up. You can say, can I get that from you? As in, can I have that from you? Words that are more lexically variable, lexically loose like that, vague, right, tend to be considered less formal than words that are more precise. When we're speaking more formally, we try to be precise, and so we'll say here things like, uh, uh, adult human male instead of less formal guy, right? Guy could be, a kid or an adult or whatever. We don't know so much about it, right? Sometimes even women are described as guys occasionally, right? So you've got received coming from French, message and note are the same sort of thing, right? A longer word uh, message than note. So those are the kind of things that you can think about when you're thinking about formality. Even more formal, something impersonal like this, your letter has been received, where the change here, think about when you might get something like this. Your letter has been received. You might get this from an institution, right? That's the word for this, institutional language. The type of letter you get from your bank or maybe an official letter from the university where the person writing it is acting on behalf of the institution, and so she or he, you don't really know or even care who he or she is, right? That it's not when I write, I got your note, I is me if I'm talking to you or if I write to you. Whereas when the bank writes to you, you'd get, your letter has been received. Well, who received it? Selma in accounts payable or Andrew in accounts receivable, whatever. It doesn't matter. You don't care, right? So they take away that personal nature of the interaction because it's not necessary and often not expected. That can be, in fact, many people find annoying when institutions try to be overly personal with you, right? People get telephone calls, hello, hello, this is if you get a phone call, hello, this is Santander calling, fine, right? But when they call and introduce themselves as if they're your friends, right? Hello, this is Vic at HSBC. How are you today? And people often find that off-putting because to them it doesn't feel like the right register for that interaction, that false informality, chatting with your friend Vic. No, military have their own other. It's not just the formality that it is attached. Register should not just be thought of as formality. I'm starting by talking about that because it's something people are familiar with. But you can also see here where it's not so much the formality as well, here probably the sir, right? That there are institutions like the military where they have certain ritualistic language forms, such as addressing someone as sir at the end of every sentence, right? And there are even sort of comical things like this next one where if you watch a film about pirates, pirates talk like pirates. If you want to make the pirates seem authentic, they have to dress like pirates and act like pirates, but they have to talk like pirates too, right? How would a pirate say something like this? Aye, aye, Captain, right? Who says aye, aye except for pirates, right? But they're saying the same kind of thing. Yes, message received, got it, whatever, I obey, something like that, but in a register that's very specific to pirates. So we expect certain registers with certain language events. Another definition of register that's earlier, but don't memorize this one. Don't focus on this one. People tend to focus on it, but it's not as useful, but it's very well known, so I want to talk about it here. Treadgill says linguistic varieties that are linked to occupations, professions, or topics have been termed registers. It makes sense, right? That this emphasis on work-related language, that certain types of work have certain types of language that go with them, and so in academics, here I wrote language and linguistics, but really academics generally, you expect certain types of language, right? You get here in linguistics, we use words like phonology instead of sound. Sound is accurate. You can talk about the sounds of language, but phonology is more accurate because phonology means the study of meaningful sounds, right? Is a sound, but it's not phonologically meaningful. And similarly, we use words like syntax instead of saying grammar because grammar could be accurate, but technically you should think of grammar as two things, both syntax and morphology. and so on, right? Lexeme for word. So we use specialized low frequency lexis. Low frequency here, you see what that means, right? Frequency, how often? Low frequency, right? Specialized topics often involve low frequency lexis because you're talking about things like syntax that has a quite specific meaning. On the other hand, high frequency lexis means just words that we hear quite frequently, right? Sound is a higher frequency word than phonology because sound applies in many fields, right? It applies to music and it applies to language, but it also applies to someone banging on the door. What's that sound? Things like that. Similarly, for register, work-related register, we see things like absence of, people tend to try to write without contractions, cannot versus can't, and passive voice is quite common. Constructions where we don't know or don't care about the actual actor, the person or people who did the thing. So we write things like, it has been discovered that, instead of saying he discovered, right? If the focus isn't on the person who did it, then it's left out, right? It is well known that. Constructions like that are quite common. Phrasal verbs tend to be less common in formal writing. Discover instead of find out, examine instead of look at, things like that, right? The reasons for this are unclear, to be honest, but it's a generally accepted property of formal language, formal academic language, that phrasal verbs should be avoided when possible. And then we tend not to use slang, of course, in formal language. And a very obvious thing, especially in written language, is the use of citations like this, the in-text citations, and the references at the end of a written work, whether it's an article or a book or even a PowerPoint presentation, will often have references. So you have these expectations, right? If I came in to give you an academic lecture and I didn't follow this, then you'd be sort of torn between, he said it's a lecture, but then he came in and said, "Sup, y'all, how you doing today?" And then he started telling jokes and talking about his weekend and explaining his, what he did with his daughter or his wife on the weekend and so on. And you say, that's not a lecture. Where's the lecture stuff? Where's the right language for the right time? So it doesn't matter what you call it, it has to have those language features or it feels like the wrong register. Work-related language, there are innumerable examples, right? I used to have a student who worked for the Transport for London, and he told me, us really, the class, many interesting examples of the way that TfL workers would talk in a register reserved for them. Sometimes they'd say things like this: one under on the hot and cold at GPS. One under on the hot and cold at GPS. It's like a code, right? Now, in this case, it was so that they could talk about sensitive matters like this one without alarming the passengers. Perhaps they were making announcements over the intercom, over the tannoy. And so here they're saying that there's something like one person has fallen or what have you under a train on the Hammersmith and City, H&C, hot and cold, Hammersmith and City at Great Portland Street, GPS, right? So something that makes it unique to them, to register of their language. And if you want to fit in, if you get a job there and you want to fit in, you learn to talk like this, right? There can sometimes be tension between learning a new register and using a new register. I'm not sure how much you care about this, but when Starbucks really took off and became more and more popular, there was, honestly, you may find it silly, but a tension between using the cup size, the drink size names that people were familiar with, and Starbucks's insistence on using their own new register, right? That a very tiny cup, an espresso size was a demi, and a small was a short, and a tall was a medium, and a grande was a large, and a venti was, extra large, 20 centiliters of coffee, and even, I don't know if they have Trenta anymore, but they certainly used to in the United States at least, a 30 centiliter coffee, right? And so you'd go in and you'd say, can I have a medium Americano? And they'd say, as service workers often do, they'd repeat it back to you for confirmation, right? You'd say, can I have an Americano, please, a black Americano? And they'd say, one tall Americano. And then people would feel like, well, I guess your tall means medium. Are you expecting me to say tall? Do I have to will I not get the order if I don't say it the way that you want me to say it? And I think it's fair. No, it's true. A lot of people found this annoying, right? This is called recasting, to sort of correct what, not sort of, to correct what someone's saying without saying directly you're wrong. So a child might say, today we swanged on the swings at the park, and the parent will say, oh, you swung at the park? So they kind of emphasize swung instead of swanged or whatever I said, but without saying you're wrong. It's not swunged or swanged, whatever you said, it's swung. They recast it, and people know that they're being recast. When you say one tall Americano for you, sir, ma'am, one tall Americano, they know they're being recast, but they didn't like it, right? We can see why Starbucks wanted to do this. It creates, just like their logo there that you can see, creates a Starbucks ethos that it adds to the distinctiveness of Starbucks versus other coffee shops. So does using this language supposedly do that. Create a special register for Starbucks. You go into a Starbucks, it looks like Starbucks, it smells like Starbucks, it sounds like Starbucks. But people, as I said, often didn't like that, right? And so using a new register can feel odd, right? To fit in. Am I using the word right? Now with Starbucks, of course, I'm talking about some people rebelling against it because they don't like being told to use a new word for something they already know. We already have the word large. Why do I need to say grande? I know what large is. But when you're learning, say, a new topic like we're doing here or maybe it's not new, but when we're discussing new topics, newish topics, it can sometimes feel odd to use the new words correctly. If you're trying to use a new word like phonology or phonetics, they're not the same, right? They're related, but they're not the same. And so you may think, oh, if I say phonetics, do I mean phonetics or should I be saying phonology? And it can feel odd. But of course, that's what teaching is, trying to get people to see the new terminology for whatever the topic and to feel comfortable using that terminology so that their language fits the register, right? I've been talking for a long time about work-related language as being about register as being something for work-related language, but and it's fine, but it's not big enough, right? Because for the reasons given here, right? That, well, you're not always at work, right? You can be a child or unemployed or whatever, and of course, even when you have a job, you're not always talking about work, right? The way you speak changes not just because of when you're at work or not. There are other situations, right? Are you with friends or with strangers? Are you feeling comfortable or feeling nervous? Are you talking about a topic that you know, or are you talking about a topic that you don't know? All of these can affect the way you use language. So the most comprehensive definition, which is largely associated with the man mentioned in the first or second slide, Halliday, M-A-K, Michael Halliday, M-A-K Halliday, he's often known as, he says that the register is these three things happening, these three sub-elements should be analyzed all at once, right? We talk about them one at a time, field, tenor, mode, but they're all happening at the same time, and changes to the situation will affect one or two or all three of these in the way the language is used. Generally, field is the topic and purpose of the language event. Tenor is the relationship between participants, and how does the language tell us about that, and how does the relationship affect the language? And mode is the type of communication. Here, mode, like mode of transportation. Are you taking a bus or a plane or a car? Mode of communication is the type of communication. There's the reference there. Field, right? topic, subject matter, content. The right away, if you see words like this, you have an indication of the field, right? Patient, medicine, asthma. We're talking about medical doctor type field, right? These are words that you probably don't use outside of when you're talking about health, unless you're using them metaphorically. People will make jokes about needing their medicine because oh, I love chocolate, where's my medicine, that kind of thing, right? As if chocolate heals them, so they're using it metaphorically, fine. But generally, words like these appear in the field of medicine. Or it can be more, that's quite generalist though, right? It can be more field specific, where it's really only used in the case of the medical register, and very low frequency, still indicates the field. Words like this, like myocardial infarction and amniocentesis, they still tell us something about the field, but they're quite specialized, right? Words that would probably only be known to either medics themselves or to people who have a good working knowledge of the etymology of language. Myocardial, myo is muscle. Myo is muscle, cardio is heart, right? So heart muscle, so you could get it from that. So the field can be quite general or quite specific, or rather the words can be quite general or quite specific and be indicative of the field as they are here. But then it can change depending on other factors, right? More informally, let's say you're talking about family. So these words are indicative of the field: dad, pa, mom, mummy, mum, and so on. They tell us about what we're talking about, family, but they're also quite informal, right? Whereas more formally, you might use terms like mother, father, sister, son, like that. So you can see now that these tell us about the field. What are we talking about? But they overlap with discussions of tenor. What about the relationship between the participants? Someone whom you are less formal with, you might be more likely to say my dad, whatever. Someone who you don't know as well, maybe you'd be more likely to say, how's your, I heard your father is sick, right? Something like that. So that's why I said I'm talking just about field now, or it says field at the top of the slide, but you have to think that all these things, field, tenor, and mode, are all happening at once, and they affect each other in terms of register variation. Quite specialist, right? How do you talk about, if you're reading a biology textbook, then you might see words like offspring and progeny, which, offspring, progeny, child, right? They mean child, but we wouldn't expect, these might be something you'd see in a biology book, every year, or a documentary, right? Every year, the wolf couple, the mating wolf pair, produce 2 offspring on average, something like that. And it sounds fine for that. That register sounds okay for that, in that mode, right? A documentary about wolves or whatever animal I said, wolves. But if you say that to someone about their kids, it might be taken as offensive, right? How are your offspring? Or as a joke, if you're close enough with them, if the tenor of your relationship was quite familiar, quite informal, then it might be taken as a joke. Otherwise, it sounds sort of insulting that you're talking about them in a way that how offspring has that feeling of animals, right? When we don't tend to use it for people. So, as I've said, we can't think of any one of these elements, field, on its own. They have to always be thought of as 3 things that are at play at once. There's a field, there's a tenor, and there's a mode. And they all have to be right for the register to seem right for the current situation. Tenor, right? Relationship. What's going on with the relationship? Or rather, not what's going on, but how does the relationship between the participants affect the language used? And so there's this element of formality is quite well known, right? That people that you're more familiar with, you become less formal with, generally. But don't forget that they overlap with the things that we just said with field, right? So it's not just the one on its own. I really want to emphasize that, because sometimes people will say, in terms of field, this happens, in terms of tenor, that happens. But you should be emphasizing that all 3 of them happen at once. The field, the tenor, and the mode are all elements that can constantly be evaluated. So we might see patient less formally, or rather less patiently you might see heart attack, more formally you might see myocardial infarction, right? Myocardial infarction is a heart attack. So that's something to do with the field. They both tell us about the field, medical, but they might tell us something about the formality. But there might also be a consideration of the relationship, not just in terms of formality, right? If you suppose your parent is struck with a heart attack, and so you go to the hospital to find out what's wrong, and the doctor says to you, your mother has had a myocardial infarction. You might then say, well, what's that? And then she or he might say, well, it's a heart attack. And you might think, well, why didn't you just say that first, right? Why did you use a specialized word that you must know most people wouldn't understand, right? And so I think if a doctor did that, they'd be making a bad judgment about the nature of the relationship. You know, you're there, you're worried about your parent, and you say, what's wrong? And they say, she's had a myocardial infarction. And you wouldn't feel that that was the right language for that time, right? For that time, you don't want the exact technical definition. You want to know quickly what's wrong with your sick or hurt, injured father or mother. Better to say, you know, bleeding than hemorrhaging or whatever, because, you know, people might be generally aware of hemorrhaging, but really there's a difference. The doctors use different words if if you're bleeding internally or if it's coming, you know, externally. So they should be thinking about the relationship as one of equality, right? This is a good word to remember, equality and authority, right? You can speak as an authority on some topic by using the precise technical language. But if you want to speak as an equal to your listeners, you'd probably use the less formal, less precise language. So I would expect that a doctor who's thinking carefully about bedside manner, as it's called, would use a more language that signaled that equality. At first, at least, they can say you've had a heart attack or your parent has had a heart attack, and then later move on to saying things like, you know, now this is technically called a myocardial infarction, and so on. Other signs of formality, such as explained earlier, are here, right, when talking about formal language in academic discourse. I gave these examples. Even with written text, I often give examples from spoken language, but even in written text, all of these things exist. People say, but how does a written text have relationship? Well, of course, if I send you an email to your name, you say, well, oh, okay, there's the relationship. But think even of this, you know, a sign that says trash only. Who is the people who produced this sign, who wrote it up, and the people, more importantly, the people who bought the sign and placed it, what relationship are they picturing with their readers of the sign? Whom is this sign aimed at? Probably you would be picturing, well, not British people, right? Americans, you know, here it would say rubbish, right? In Britain it would say rubbish. Trash is a much more American term for this, right? So that idea of relationship does exist. You're not writing or placing the trash only sign for someone you know, but you're basing it on a relationship of, well, picturing them as Americans, right? The target audience. A little more, here someone's chosen to be a little more polite about it, let's say. Place sounds quite nice, right? Place all trash in the proper container, as opposed to, you know, bin it or chuck it in the bin or dump that in the garbage, something like that, right? A little more polite, a little more formal. Here we see both the English and the Spanish, right? So perhaps picturing that the readers are people in the United States, where many of them are native English speakers, but of course, millions of them are native Spanish speakers. And so acknowledging that by making a choice, the right register for the right time. Here we are in southern United States somewhere. The right language here should be both Spanish and English. Enough of those, right? Mode, the method of communication, right? Most of us only have two possible modes of language we can speak or we can write. Some people have a third mode, sign language, right? Sign language, which is a fully independent mode. They're not just spelling out words by, you know, uh, I can, sorry, you can't see my hand, but anyway, these are, it's a separate language, it's got its own grammar, it's a separate entire mode of language. It's not just English by spelling out letters or whatever. I want to make that clear because it's fair to say that, right? That to acknowledge there is a third mode, most of us don't have access to it. We have spoken or written language is the first consideration, and it's often useful to think about mode as planned or spontaneous. It tends to be that written language is more planned. We take our time writing our essays, time writing our books, even our emails, even our texts, right? A text message takes longer to write than it does to say that thing. Spoken language tends to be more spontaneous. You say things quite quickly as the thoughts coalesce and firm up, formalize in your head, and then you speak spontaneously. Uh, More formal language tends to be planned, less formal language tends to be spontaneous. It doesn't mean things are one or the other. You could talk about this presentation I'm giving you is a good example of, let's call it semi-planned language. I obviously have a plan. It's on the PowerPoint slides that you're looking at. But I'm not just reading a speech word by word, right? So it's not entirely planned. So you might call it, like I said, semi-planned. I've got a plan, but not word for word, right? Uh, a sermon in a religious ceremony might be more planned than this, right? A comedian would have a lot of planning in his or her jokes. Some of them are so planned that although they appear to be spontaneous, they say, oh, let me tell you this. They say the exact same thing every show, right? Others are much more spontaneous. So planned, written, formal, generally, spoken, spontaneous, informal, generally, but not always, of course. Here's some examples of written versus spoken, not particularly difficult to picture. Of course, written language can contain spoken language. Novels tend to be written in a sort of generally middle level formality in language use. But then when characters talk, of course, the characters themselves can be very formal or informal, right? Um, Spoken texts can be based on written text, right? You have a speech, or like I'm doing now, you have something written and then you talk, and so it has a general structure that will be the same each time you give it, but will be somewhat spontaneous in mode. And so that's how you could say it, right? That's the way you can use the language. A lecture tends to be spoken mode based on a planned written text. You can use the words like that. Um, some other examples of planned versus spontaneous here that you can just read. Pause if you need to. Here is where, as I said before with Starbucks, a good way to get a feeling for register is that if you're using the wrong language for the time and place that you're in, people may be alienated, right? Like I said with the doctor, using over specialized language could make the people feel stupid. Are you trying to make me feel stupid by using words that I don't know? Why are you not trying to be communicative? Are you trying to create distance between us by using that alienating language? I would hope not. I would hope a doctor would take that into account, right? Similarly, I would hope that I do that, right? That I create a feeling of inclusivity by either explaining words that I think you don't know by explaining them very quickly at the start, or by giving you readings to read about them first before I talk about them, right? If I just came in and used the words without making any attempt at equality with you, uh, you'd think, well, why is he just talking to make himself feel clever by using all these big words? Doesn't he want to use an appropriate register to both talk about the field accurately, but to create a good relationship, tenor, with us in this mode, lecture, semi-planned, spoken mode lecture? Think about how you may, in my case, when I was young, if my name is Sean Sutherland, everybody knows me as Sean Sutherland. But in fact, when I was young, if I heard my mother or father say William Sean Sutherland, then I might know that I was in trouble, right? Because that's my full name. William Sean Sutherland, didn't I tell you to clean your room? Uh, this overly formal full name can signal anger, right? That when do I see my full name? William Sean Sutherland. Only in formal sort of government documents, banking documents, and so on, right? My full name like that. It's that institutional use of my name that includes the William that otherwise isn't included. If my mother or father goes from calling me, Shawnee, which signals that closeness of nicknames, mother, father. They go from calling me Shawnee to William Sean Sutherland. They've gone from being, friendly dad, mom that makes my sandwich for lunch and cuts up an apple to being authoritarian, governmental type parent who's now responsible for making sure that I clean up my room, right? For enforcing the laws of the house. Spontaneous language in a situation that calls for planning. See, on the other hand, right? Spontaneous language, when you'd expect some amount of planning, could seem disrespectful. A very obvious example would be if a lecturer turned up and seemed to just be, winging it, as they say. You expect someone to come prepared with a structure, prepared with topics, prepared with examples and definitions. And if they come in and aren't doing that, you'd think, well, why did I waste my time coming here? Why did I waste my money paying for this when this person doesn't seem to have even done the right thing, which was to prepare, right? Monty Python, an old British comedy troupe, are known for their jokes by mixing up registers, right? They use, "O Lord, bless this hand grenade that with it thou mayest blow thy enemies to tiny bits in thy mercy, and the Lord did grin." So we've got this sort of religious language, bless, Lord, mayest, but then it crosses over with language like hand grenade and grin. Hand grenade doesn't seem like the right topic for, in this case, Christian Bible stuff. And we don't tend to think of the Lord as grinning. There's something seems too informal about grinning for something that the Lord would do, right? So they do this sort of thing, messing around with the appropriateness of register. You can find, there are books where people do things like talk about, choose a certain thing, politics, right? And lay out the expected register of this topic, politics, right? I mean, if we're talking about political language, you expect it to be like this, right? For them to be talking about politics, to be trying to inform you about their party's policy, and perhaps to persuade you about their policy. Not only do we think this, but we want you to vote for us because of that, right? They have quite formal tenor, especially in the House of Commons. They must say these certain ritualistic phrases, or they can be even actually punished, I understand, for not doing it appropriately. The mode, often planned for speeches, but semi-planned only because there's a certain art that scores you points. Let's say if you get up and speak about the topic, but quickly include items from the day's news and quickly respond to criticisms or hectoring from the other political party and so on, right? So you could do this with other topics. I won't read them, I'll just put them up and you can, I'll put them up and you can have a quick look. And you can find examples of these in Sarah Thorne's book that's listed at the end of this PowerPoint presentation. But you could do it with anything. I was thinking about Star Wars, science fiction films that I'm not going to bore you with them. It's not like I particularly love them, but there's a line that everyone knows. So there's this field specific stuff, right? The spaceships and planets and so on that tells us about the field. But there's this one bit where there's this guy in black here and there's the guy in white here, and the black suited robot looking guy, he's not a robot, doesn't matter. He's a bad guy. And the guy in white, gray, is the good guy. And the guy in black says, this is the big shock of one of the films. He says, Luke, the guy in black says, Luke, I am your father. And that's a big shock to find out that the villain is the hero's father. And I was thinking you could say the same words, but in a different register, and all of a sudden it would seem very silly, right? Why doesn't he say, Luke, I'm your dad? It means the same thing, but it has such different connotations, right? Dad, close, familial, right? You call presuming that you like your dad, you call your dad, whereas father is distant, right? And so we just don't expect, and the use of the contraction I am versus I'm, right? We just don't expect that, right? For there to be such informal language use like that, contractions and dad versus I am, the full form, and father. Uh, the mode of this is written but spoken and planned, right? It's written, of course, the script is written, but then it's spoken by the actors, so it's fully planned. They follow the script, right? And you could do the same for many different types of genres, right? The genre, the type of, historical genre, comic genre, and so on, right? You could do that with many different types of genre. Look at the relationship between the conventions of the genre. The conventions of sci-fi include spaceships and aliens. Within the genre, we have certain linguistic conventions. The register, right? We expect there to be certain types of language used, as in the example I just gave. Here we have 3 examples of letters that you can look through at your own time and think about these things, right? I'm not going to talk through them one by one. We can do that together when we're interacting live. But what you see here are 3 examples of letters, and you could go through and think, what is the field of these? How do I know, right? What is the purpose? How do I know? By noting individual words or phrases. What is the tenor, right? Is it formal, informal? Do the people have a close relationship or a distant relationship? Is it a relationship of equality or authority? And about the mode, right? Are these written or spoken? Well, they're obviously written because they're letters that you're reading, but think about the spontaneity versus the plannedness of them, right? So I'll show them all one by one, and you can pause on each one and make notes about that for discussion later. Good. And here's the list of references. There's Thorn that I mentioned earlier as being quite a good one for talking about for listing different features of different registers of language. Okay, thank you very much.